So we see that protest spreads very quickly to Egypt. And I think it's the Egyptian story that really has captured people's attention. It's really been a roller coaster, political roller coaster of both the exhilaration of being able to see millions of Egyptian protesters standing up against an authoritarian regime that has essentially been in place since 1952, to elections, and now we're sort of at a new low point with the 2013 military coup against the freely elected president. So let's talk about who protested in Egypt, and we'll cover some obvious issues first. One, it seemed that men tended to be more represented in the streets relative to their percentage of the population. The protesters tended to be relatively young, not old, and a variety of class backgrounds were represented. It wasn't exclusively a poor people's movement, nor was it one that was entirely dominated by the wealthy. But based on some of the research I've done using survey data, I wanted to try to dig into this a little bit more. So a nationally representative sample of Egyptians were asked just prior to the uprisings, would you consider attending a lawful or peaceful demonstration? And I think the results are quite interesting. About 8% of respondents said yes. Now, if we assume there are about 80 million people in Egypt, this would be about 6 million individuals who suggested they might have an inclination to participate in protests of this type. So who were these individuals? While a willingness to answer yes to this question wouldn't guarantee you would protest, nor would answering no guarantee you wouldn't, I think we can still gauge something about willingness to take that type of risk based on how people respond to these surveys. So of those who responded they would protest, about 45% were women, but most of the people we saw in the streets, particularly in the early days of the protests, were men. Now, this probably wasn't surprising because, as we know, the Egyptian protest locales were extremely dangerous places for women. Not only were there thugs, there were also a number of sexual crimes reported. These sexual crimes have continued. There's better monitoring now of the type of, what happens to women in these public spaces, but it's not an issue that has completely been resolved. So here, for this statistical analysis, I looked just within the sample of men. What can we say we know? So about 12% of men said they were willing to protest. But this percentage goes up for certain subgroups. If you were under the age of 35, about 17% of those men said they were willing to protest. If you had a formal education, it went up another notch to 18%. If you were from the upper middle class, it almost doubles to 31%. If you were a regular internet user, you were 35%, right? So if accumulating all of these things, if you were a young man who had an upper middle class formal education, you used the internet, you were 36% of those men said they were willing to protest. If you were interested in politics, then it goes up to 50%. So we can kind of get a sense of what the demographic was of the type of person who would say they were willing to engage in this type of protest. And it seems to map on pretty well to what we observe in the more qualitative literature associated with who was involved. So what we can say from this, it wasn't just those people who were aggrieved socioeconomically, but it seemed to also be people who were socially aware. Maybe if we think that people who have a college education or higher formal education are more socially aware, and socially connected, if we believe that people who are regular internet users are more socially connected people, who are likely to say they protest. So if we look at the news reports coming out of the New York Times, for example, in the days right after the protest, the headline reads, "Wired and shrewd young Egyptians guide revolt." So there was a certain type, a certain group. They weren't all of the protesters, but I think they represented a kind of protest vanguard that turned out to be quite influential. So why were people seeking to change the regime in Egypt? Some people would say Mubarak was a relatively benevolent dictator. Mubarak didn't know he was being recorded by his ear, nose, and throat doctor recently, and I don't know if any of you guys saw the news story, but those recordings came out, and he, even in his own conversations that he believed to be private, said, I've really shepherded Egypt through a difficult time. My people, even though, the economy hasn't grown, they get to eat. They've been educated to some degree. People aren't starving in the streets, and he really felt as though he had done a service to his population. But the Egyptians were picking up, I think, on some more subtle factors that were really quite significant. One was a growing income inequality. So in the last 20 years, we've seen the rise of a very, very affluent class of Egyptians, but they represent a tiny, tiny percentage of the population. So modest affluence is enjoyed by just 5% of Egyptians. And 3% of Egyptians are responsible for half of consumer spending. So the vast, vast, vast majority of people are living a very simple existence. And then there is a very small elite class, which gets to enjoy all of the benefits of the changing economy in Egypt over the move away from socialism to a more market economy over the last 20, 25 years. So half the population lives on less than $2 a day. So these are people who don't get to eat meat on a regular basis, for example. Most of their diet consists of beans, rice, bread, and some very simple vegetarian foods. These are not people who have a lot of consumer power. And so there was a real sense of this growing divide in the country. But what's interesting is the protesters were not demanding economic redistribution as the primary target of what they wanted to see change in the country. This may have been an underlying motivation, but it didn't seem to be the thing that really led them out into the streets in those early days. People seem to be really fired up and angry about corruption and abuse of power, however. And so we knew that citizens in Egypt were enraged by the byproducts of both economic corruption and by police abuse. So there would be scandals regularly in the press about, for example, some Egyptian economic mogul selling milk to the population that had been powdered milk that had been adulterated with paint thinner or some kind of a additive. Economic entrepreneurs who had imported glassware or some kind of a product from China that was coated in lead, that then young people were poisoned by that, right? So these were things where the government really was not protecting the population in the way that people expected them to. And so this economic corruption really became quite an issue. Now the police abuse was also quite significant. So we know that police brutality and human rights abuses were a huge motivation for the people who initially came out in the early days of the 2011 uprisings. And there was a particular case that really was quite salient for many of these protesters. And I'll talk about that in a minute. So if we think about Egypt and what the local protest triggers might have been, a few things come to mind. The first was President Mubarak was approaching his 80th birthday. He was increasingly sort of thinking about who would succeed him as the next president of Egypt. And there was a lot of discussion, a lot of controversy about who that might be. And one of the possibilities was that he might be succeeded by his own son, Gamal Mubarak, who was a businessman, part of the National Democratic Party, which was the hegemonic party in Egypt before 2011. And this was a very unpopular proposition. Not only did Gamal sort of lack the charisma of the previous leaders, but he was really seen as part of the problem in that he was one of these economic cronies who didn't really have a lot of interest in the well-being of the population, but was sort of instead interested in enriching himself and the people around him. Now, just 2 months before the uprisings, Egypt had had a round of parliamentary elections. Now, in these elections, they were never truly free and fair in that anybody could participate and anyone could win in particular districts. But they had historically been very competitive, meaning if you sort of got on the list of people who might compete, it wasn't always manipulated. You might actually freely compete for a particular seat. But the 2010 parliamentary elections were really problematic in that the Muslim Brotherhood, which had previously had about 20% of the parliament, won almost no seats. There was a lot of repression, a lot of violence against voters. And so this was sort of an event that happened just before that I think had people really thinking this regime is not going to change. We don't have a hope of democratic reform within the system. We need to do something big to change things on the street. Now, I mentioned that the police abuse was a very big issue for many of the early protesters. And here, the killing of a young man in the port city of Alexandria was quite salient, a man named Khalid Saeed. And he was a young man who was in an internet cafe. He was dragged out of the cafe by the police and basically murdered in front, by hand by these policemen just in plain sight in the day. You might ask, what did he do to really make the police so angry? Some people say that he had recorded with a camera phone or cell phone some kind of an illicit transaction taking place between policemen and others, maybe related to drugs in his town, and that they were upset that he might have that information on them. So there was a very well-known Facebook page, we are all Khalid Saeed, kulluna Khalid Saeed, and so people said, you know, we're really upset by this. We can't allow this type of thing to happen. There were hundreds of thousands of people who joined the Facebook page. There was a young woman who basically said, I'm going to go out and protest this regime. Her YouTube video got, you know, hundreds of thousands of hits. She really tried to appeal to the young men in the community. She said, here I am as a young woman. All of you are like my brothers. You should come out and protect me. If I'm brave enough to go out there and withstand the possibility of police abuse. She tried to appeal to the chivalrous, almost paternalistic nature of Arab society to try to encourage all of the young men to also come out and protest the killing of this young man and the other abuses of the regime. So what was kind of ironic was the January 25th, the day of these big uprisings, what was called the Day of Rage, was actually Police Day in Egypt. So if you picked up the newspaper from that particular day, the headline would read, flowers and chocolates for the police on this day, right? So they chose this day because it had a particular irony, right? The day that we were supposed to be, that Egyptians everywhere were supposed to be thanking their police officers for their amazing service. Instead, the police have killed this young man. There's been all this abuse of power. And so they chose this day as the Day of Rage. And you see one female protester here holding a picture of Khalid Saeed. You know, this is sort of the rallying cry for many people. And so, you know, he's got his hoodie on, and this is sort of like the image that people had of how the death of just one young Egyptian man, and there had been many who had been killed before him, somehow mobilized a population. And I guess we'll never really know why Mohammed Bouazizi was the one, why his suicide led people in Tunisia to engage in their activism, or why the killing of Khalid Saeed led people in Egypt to engage in their activism. But sometimes these individual events can be very significant. So here he's holding, of course, a tiny little Hosni Mubarak. So a couple of days after the the Day of Rage and the start of the protest, we see the burning of the National Democratic Party headquarters. So this is an aerial image of Tahrir Square, and where you see kind of all of that smoke. There was a multi-story, like a 10-story National Democratic Party. This is the hegemonic party of the ruling regime. Their party headquarters, it's basically burned. A couple of days after that is what's known as the famous Battle of the Camel. So the Egyptian regime decided they were going to unleash upon the protesters a number of thugs. So they had always kind of had these guys in their back pocket, people who would go out and create problems at election time, who would go and beat up voters for the opposition. And so they sent them out on horseback. You can see one guy on horseback kind of coming down in the lower left-hand corner, and then the guy here in the center on the camel, to go and beat up the protesters. Now, the Battle of the Camel is significant because up until that day, the Muslim Brotherhood had not participated in a serious way in the Egyptian uprisings. They had been laying back, even though they're the primary opposition group in the country, they were not part of the vanguard of the protest movement. But some people say the Battle of the Camel was the day the brothers saved the revolution. Because if you look very carefully, what you'll see is there are quite a few men who might fit sort of the stereotypical description of a Muslim brother, you know, a bearded, sort of middle-aged man, who then would be, they were in the streets that day. They knew how to push back against this type of thuggery. And some people believe that if they had not intervened on the day of the Battle of the Camel, the revolution would have gone a very different way. That the protesters would have been dispersed, that Mubarak would not have stepped down, but somehow it was the combined strength and tactical ability of both the Muslim Brotherhood and this protest vanguard that really pushed forward the momentum of the revolution. So just 1 week after the Battle of the Camel, we see that Mubarak is deposed. And here we have a senior official in the security apparatus announcing this. And very shortly after that, we see that there's military rule by a group known as the SCAF, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces. So the country quickly reverts to what was its kind of pre-Mubarak status quo, which was, basically military rule. So one thing that the SCAF did do is they introduced the opportunity for relatively free parliamentary elections to take place later that year. And I apologize if this is small, but what you can see is that the free elections in Egypt that took place in 2011 were really a boon to Islamist parties. And the top two seat getters, both the Freedom and Justice Party, which was the political wing of the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Noor Party, which was the political wing of kind of a group of Salafi parties, so they're even to the right of the Muslim Brotherhood, together, they get about 70% of votes and seats. And this was perhaps surprising to some, but maybe not so surprising if we think about the underlying inclinations of the Egyptian population, combined with the mobilizational capacity of Islamist organizations, which tend to be very well organized. They work in cells where people are very closely attached to the other people in their unit. There's a lot of social capital built up in these organizations, and you can really get people to go out and do things that might otherwise be costly, like waiting 6 hours in line to vote. Even if you know that you might be subjected to forms of thuggery or some political violence. So one thing that I've tried to do in some of my previous research is think about, does that 60, 70% number kind of match up with what we believed would be the level of support for the religious right in a place like Egypt? So I pulled this from a paper I wrote in 2008, which tries to estimate the percent in each of a series of Muslim-majority countries of the support for kind of fundamentalist values or these religious right values. And what you can see not very well is that in Egypt, which is the second country here from your left, it estimates the value in Egypt to be about 65%, right? So this is based on the responses that Egyptians gave to a series of survey questions about whether they believe that there should be a confluence of religion and politics. Do you believe that there's a role for women in certain economic or political realms? And if we take all of those questions and kind of aggregate them into a scale and then think about how are Egyptians answering those questions, about 65% of Egyptians hold values that we would consider to be pretty religious and conservative. And so I don't think we should be too surprised then that these religious groups, if you add to that the tactical advantage they enjoyed because of their organizational capacity, would be able to pull about 70% in an election. Now, we can also kind of validate this against results from other surveys. For example, the Pew firm does many surveys of the region, including a survey of Egypt, where people are asked, what are your views on the Muslim Brotherhood? About 37% said very favorable, another 38% said somewhat favorable. So there's a relatively large population within the country that has relatively favorable views toward groups and values that tend to be associated with this kind of religious conservatism. What percent want laws to follow the Quran? About 60%, with another 27% saying they want to follow the values and principles of Islam, even if they don't want to follow the holy texts word for word. In 2012, we see Egypt's first fair and free presidential election. Now, there were 5 major candidates for this, in addition to dozens of minor candidates. Mohammed Morsi on the far left is the candidate of the Muslim Brotherhood. He gets about 25% of the vote. Ahmed Shafiq, what I'm calling the regime Falul. Falul is the Egyptian term for the remnants. So there were a set of people who were sort of considered the remnants of the regime, the leftovers from the previous regime. He was the last prime minister of Egypt. He came from an Air Force background. He was really considered somebody who was part of the status quo governance. He got about 24%. So at this point, Egypt had already seen a pretty significant increase in violence, street violence, economic violence, political violence. Some people wanted a return to a safer time, a status quo from before the revolution. There was a leftist, Hamdin Sabahi, he got about 20%. This was quite surprising to a lot of people. So if we saw economic vote, we saw it emerging for this particular individual. A liberal Islamist who had previously been part of the Muslim Brotherhood Guidance Council but had broken off got about 18%. And then a well-known Egyptian diplomat who had been their previous Minister of Foreign Affairs, their representative to the Arab League, Amr Musa, he got about 11%. So that would be kind of like if like a Colin Powell or somebody like that had run. There would be some people who would just sort of support them because of their prominence and their good reputation. So we can see that the Islamist candidates are garnering about 45% of the presidential vote. The old guard, the Filul type candidates, holdovers from the previous regime, about another 35%. But really this race between the top two was really a very tough race. It was very close. So this is a map of the Egyptian Delta and Cairo, which shows the distribution of votes. Well, I should say one thing first, that the top two vote getters would then go on to a second round, where then they would compete just against each other, right? So this was the first round. They sort of determined who were the top vote getters, and then we had a runoff between Morsi and Shafiq. And so the red votes, or the red areas, are the areas that support Mohammed Morsi, the Muslim Brotherhood candidate, the blue supporting Ahmed Shafiq. And what we can see is there really is a lot of geographic distribution of support for these two candidates. The country is pretty divided over whether they want to see one versus the other, and it was really considered quite a tough choice for many people. Even people who didn't really support the Muslim Brotherhood, or who didn't really like the Muslim Brotherhood, but really wanted to see through some kind of a payoff from the revolution, might have voted for Mohammed Morsi. If we look at the distribution of votes kind of in central Egypt, so you know in Egypt almost all of the population lives either in the Delta and Cairo or the thin strip of land on either side of the Nile River. The rest is largely uninhabited desert. So that kind of explains the shape of this area. What we can see is that this sort of area of Middle Egypt almost entirely went to Mohammed Morsi. So these are rural areas, areas maybe with some less sophisticated voters, voters who are at some distance from the city center. And then if we look at the lower Egypt, so sort of the part of Egypt that's along the Nile closest to Sudan, we see again maybe slight support for Shafiq, but also it's not really really decisive. So we end up with Mohammed Morsi winning the election, as you guys know, and he's in office for just one short year before the decisions the Muslim Brotherhood and his, the Morsi regime made in power led people to be so dissatisfied that there was another mass uprising that took place in July 2013. Now, this mass uprising was used as an opportunity by the military to then reassert their authority and take power back away from the Muslim Brotherhood, the freely elected president of Egypt. And as you guys know, Mohammed Morsi is now in jail. He's awaiting trial. The Muslim Brotherhood supporters will continue to say it's a military coup. But if you talk to a lot of Egyptians, they don't like to hear it described as a coup. They describe what happened as a popular revolt against a regime that they were unhappy with, kind of a national referendum in the streets. And they're very comfortable with the idea that power might be taken back from an elected president via non-electoral means.